In this video, we are going to cover the seam finish called Stitched and Pinked. And this is a pretty straightforward seam finish as we saw with the previous video of the serge seam finish. So this is one of the easiest ways to do a seam finish. In essence, what you're going to be doing is you're going to have a stitched line on each edge of your seam allowance, and then you're going to be pinking it. This is only applied to the seam allowance, not to any other portion. And so this is, you can see it on this yellow one as well, called the Stitched and Pinked. Now, just a little bit of history here. Pinking is probably one of the oldest forms of seam finish, just to protect your edges. And the reason for that is as you are cutting each of these into a little triangle, or sometimes it used to be almost like a scallop, you're minimizing the number of threads that can be pulled off for each one of those points. And so in order to get down to a place where you're pulling all the threads off, and then starting to compromise the amount of seam allowance for your garment, then you have to do that on every single one of these little pinked edges. So that is why it is a very tried and true, old-fashioned way to do a seam finish. It is also probably the most accessible of the different kinds of seam finishes, because the only thing you need to have is a pair of scissors, or in today's modern sort of cutting tools, you can also use a roller cutter that has a pinked blade on it. So I have my Olfa here, and it actually has a pinked blade, and I can easily replace those. They have a couple of different styles, but most often I'm just going to be using a good old-fashioned pair of pinking scissors. I say this all the time to my students: you don't have to buy an expensive pair of pinking shears, as they can be very difficult and tricky to sharpen. So I generally will just get an inexpensive pair from any department store, sort of like Walmart or Target, where they sell sewing supplies, and you can just get a pair of good old Fiskars. They do great. So this is a pair of Mundial, but I also have several pairs of Fiskars that I alternate between. So these are the tools that we would need. So let's get started on how we do the seam finish. It's pretty straightforward to begin with. We're going to do just like we do on all of our seam finish edges. So we need a seam to be able to finish. So here is my seam finish, the edge that I'm going to finish. I basically have stitched two pieces of fabric together, creating a 5/8 inch seam, and then I'm pressing it open. And so you can see here that this is the right side. It just looks like a seam, and this is the other side. Then I am going to be putting a stitch line on each of my seam allowances. The stitch line is sort of just like a backup. So just in case it ever did get past all those pinked edges, the stitch line is there to help secure the threads and keep them from falling off even further. So it's just a little bit of added security to each of the seam finish. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my seam and I'm going to pull it up, and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch away from my seam, from this first stitch line that I did when I stitched the two pieces together. So that is one side, and you can see there's the other side. Back stitch at the beginning and the end. Then we're going to pink it. So here is my third piece to show you guys the samples, and I have not pinked this yet because I'm going to go ahead and pink it right now. So I'm going to pull this away, and we are just going to use my pinking shears, and I am going to keep a little bit in from my stitch line because I don't want to cut off or risk cutting off my stitch line, but I'm just sort of trying to keep very consistent and trim off the edge and get my pinked edge. So, and then I'm going to do the other side. So just always try to make sure you're pulling away all your garment fabric so you don't accidentally cut anything. And then we are going to finish cutting this edge with the pinking shears. When using pinking shears, it's recommended you only do one layer at a time to help keep your fabric from dulling, or your scissors from dulling faster. So there is my stitched and pinked seam finish.